All, I am Nayana Gupta, and I'll be presenting to you the Moh-Maya project, which was my final year graduation project from Srishti Institute back in 2016. So the Moh-Maya project is about an approach to experimental typography and critical thinking. And I hope that through this slideshow it kind of self-clarifies. But to start, I'd like to talk about the intent. The intent was to figure out a way to approach typography rather than arriving at a predefined answer. In other words, I wanted to understand what Moh-Maya meant through typography, and I wanted to understand typography through Moh-Maya. The second and the third was to have fun, very, very important. And the last was to explore typography through tangible substances within controlled and uncontrolled environments. To explain that, I'd like to take you through this project that I stumbled across when I was researching, as we all should. It's called the Visual Subway by Craig Ward. And what he did was he went around the subway lines in New York City and he took bacterial samples. Then he swabbed them and put them in these sponges, which were cut out in according to the seat number or the train number. And then he let these microbes incubate and live. And this is what he came up with. This resulting image was basically a representation of the diversity and the complex interaction, which served as a striking visual analogy for the city itself. And I thought that was pretty profound. And I wanted to ingrain this project into something that would be culturally relevant, something that would be not just about type, but interaction with typography, self-evolving, self-directing typography, if possible. So back to Moh-Maya. Now, I'm sure a lot of you already have an idea of what this means, but just to clarify, the concept of Moh-Maya is about nirvana, about the ascension of the soul and how to do it. Moh in Sanskrit means desire or attachment or love for something, and Maya represents the illusionary aspect of the world. So, according to Hinduism and Sikhism and a few other isms, to attain real happiness or true liberation of your soul, you have to let go of Moh-Maya, you have to let go of the illusionary aspect of the world, and so on and so forth. And since I was playing around with tangible objects, I thought, why not select objects that could represent fragility, decay, old memories, concepts of self-identity, attachments, maybe things that are rooted in culture and religion, that have significances that have been made by the society, or maybe a representation of the illusionary aspect of the world, so as to speak. The idea of property, of material possessions, and every worldly thing that really has no meaning according to Moh-Maya. So now I'll be jumping down to the explorations that I put forward. The first was the Cane and Vickers series. I picked Cane because of its easy availability and also because its intrinsic characteristics, its flexibility. Now, although there were a plethora of objects and materials that I could have picked, it was important that I pick objects and substances that could be explored, played around, bent or twisted. So what I did was, I went to a craftsman in their own area and I asked them to develop the script. And I saw how they would make it and studied the anatomy. Now, whatever is being formed here is mostly due to its own properties of the cane and very little of what I wanted. I had an outline, it needed to be Devanagari, it needed to be a certain size and so on and so forth. But cane can only be bent with fire to a certain degree. And that was a fascinating thing to see and a very new aesthetic. But while I documented the process, the documentation and photography became a series of its own, which I thought was fabulous. But when I had this very rigid script in Devanagari saying Moh-Maya, I wondered what to do with it, and I took it everywhere and see what could come of it. And I noticed the shadows it casted. through time, through different angles. And the distortion of the shadow is a very interesting part of it. So the construction of images and the construction of meaning through images came into play. And studying the form and the negative and the positive space through a very rigid, tangible Devanagari script became a part of this series. After this, I embarked upon the Possession series. While I was working with the cane and wicker, I noticed that we as human beings have an obsession with locks. It's everywhere. It's apparently protecting gods. It's protecting everything. It's protecting open spaces. And when I see these locks, I immediately wanted to look at the keys. So I went out on the streets and asked people to let me photograph their keys. Most of them flat out denied. But this one gentleman, he let me do it. And when he let me do it, he said, "Le lo photo chabi ki, mere paas kaun si daulat hai chupane ke liye," which roughly translates to, "Go ahead, take the snapshot. I have no fortune to hide." I thought that was a brilliant analogy for ownership, a brilliant way to put forward how one metal piece represented so much of material possessions, their ownership, an idea of status quo. So obviously this would have to be the next object that I would play around with. What I did after taking several photographs was take the keys, wheeled them together. Now, since they are not as flexible as cane, they had their own restrictions, but they had a visual quality to it. I got this from, again in Devanagari script, but very distinctive, and then I stamped it to understand the form, the shape. And then with a slight modification, this is what I got. The textual and the visual quality of it, the requirement of the participant to engage with it and kind of decipher what this is. Are you reading it first or are you looking at it, and what do the shapes are, became a very playful nature to this concept. After this, but when I look at something like this, at this juncture, I realized that clarity and legibility also needed to come into play somewhere. So the next exploration, named as repetition and absorption, was simply movement-centric, especially, again, in the research work that I was doing. I went through a lot of Japanese calligraphy techniques where it was about the strokes, the movement. And of course, that's a different presentation, so we can't go in there right now. But I tried to replicate this continuous movement, almost as if meditating or concentrating, and went through several newsprint. What I saw was this textural quality, this absorption, this fading, which became a very intrinsic and a very interesting look at Moh-Maya, that the medium would absorb a part of the paint. I did this using this bamboo stick called kitta, so it lent certain shapes to it. At the same time, when you're making, when you're sketching something or doing it with your hand, forms tend to flow more naturally, and it gave me an idea of the forms, of more natural forms. The next is called the cocoon objective. I wanted to play around with another metaphor that I had my eye on, which was a silkworm cocoon, which I thought really stood for the kind of layers and priorities, self-identity, ego that we as humans tend to wrap ourselves around. And Moh-Maya is all about breaking through that identity. Moh-Maya is all about opening it, studying it, and reading into it. So, and this shell had a very strange texture, a very unique, fragile yet stiff texture that I hardened using adhesive, and I got this very distinctive shape, almost sculpturistic. Moving forward, I wanted to look at something simpler, something more malleable, so I went back to good old paper. But I was thinking more about Moh-Maya, and I was thinking more about how all letters, all letter forms, all characters are intrinsically puzzles, especially for people who might not be familiar with the script. It's something that you have to relook, analyze, uncode, decode. So I opened it up and I let it loop. Now Devanagari has this very unique loop structure. So I'll just move forward, and with this kind of a loop, what I did was the final meditative engagement piece is I made this installation, which was a movement-centric installation, dynamic type, something that asks for engagement. You would notice that the shape here is inspired from the first Ian and Vickers series. So that's how the kind of shapes and form kind of flowed. This is almost like a puzzle, and all of these are taken apart. Just like you have to take apart an idea or a concept, and you were kind of allowed to move it. It could seem garbled, it could make sense to you, but on the whole, it would be a person's engagement in the space. I'd just like to show you the video, which would take just a second. So, this is how, sorry, the video isn't playing. Try again. So you would see the shadow and kind of know how to move it, and it wasn't about getting the script right, it was mainly about you interacting with the elements of it and figuring it out. Now, I'm nearly done. The conclusion part of it is that it doesn't really have any conclusion, but for academic purposes, it was about understanding and decoding one concept through other, typography through Moh-Maya. It was about figuring out how to open conversations about how to root type in culture in your own perspective and have you engage with it one-on-one, and it was about fun. So thank you for the